Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today, again, we're looking at Was Gott tut, das ist wohlgetan, which translates to what God does that is done well. This is an interesting chorale, namely because of the fact that it has instrumental interludes, and if you've seen any of my videos in the past that have had chorales that have instrumental interludes, you'll know that I exclude them because I'm focusing primarily on Bach's vocal writing on the channel. But please, instead of exclusively listening to the choral reduction that I included at the beginning of the video, feel free to find a recording on your own and listen to the entirety of the movement to see how the instrumental, like the interplay, plays a role on the movement, because it definitely does. There could be things going on in the instruments that otherwise would change the context in which the voices are being introduced, which has been the case in some of the past chorales we've looked at. However, in this chorale, all of the voices more or less follow the same progression. Well, not the exact same, but a very similar progression to the chorale that we looked at yesterday. So if you want to look at a purely vocal rendition of, or a close to a purely vocal rendition of this chorale, watch yesterday's video, which is episode 150. But we should just get right into the analysis. So we have one sharp in the key signature. We start off on G major. We end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major. And we stay in G major more or less for the entirety of the chorale. We get a phrase in D, we get a brief visit to C, but we stay in G more or less for the entirety of the chorale. But yeah, we start off with, sorry about that. We start off in the key of G major with our one chord, passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and then we, if we actually look at this progression here, F sharp, A, D, and D, we find our hidden 5-6 chord there happening in passing. This is a very harmonically dense chorale where Bach subdivides the harmonic rhythm often. But the 1 to 5-6 is it's a normal progression, probably the most common progression you'll find at the beginning of the chorale. And just like yesterday's chorale, we see E, B, E, and G, which is a 6 chord. So we see 1, 5, 6 going to 6. This is E minor in root position. Passing 7th in the bass. This is also a passing 7th on the and a 4, the incomplete measure. And then we have E, A, E, and A, or sorry, C, A, E, and A, which is A minor over C, which is 2, 6. Seeing 6 go to 2 is a good sign, as that's where it would go via the cycle of falling fifths. D, A, F sharp, and A, that's D major in root position. So we have a passing 5 chord there. We would expect 2 to go to 5, and that goes to 1, G major, G, 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 and B. Incomplete triad, but still implied nonetheless. We then have this little, kind of like a suspension figure, but it resolves upwards and not by step, so the same rhythmic implications of a suspension, but it's more purely for its expressivity rather than, its intervallic content. So if we're looking at the C here, we have C, G, C, and E, which is C major in root position. That's a 4 chord. And then we're getting ready for our imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So we have B, G, D, and D. That's G major over B. That's a 1-6 chord. This C is a neighbor tone. This C is also a neighbor tone. This E is a neighbor tone. This E is also a neighbor tone. So if we look in between the lines, we see that we just have a 1-6 chord here happening over 2 beats, preceding D, D, F sharp, and D, which is a 5 chord, D major, incomplete but still there. We get the rest of the chord on the and of the same beat. This A is a chord tone, this D is a chord tone, but this C is a delayed passing 7th before we cadence on G major, G, D, G, and B. It's a tonic triad in root position. And then as we move to the end of the A section, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. We start off on an E minor chord, E, G, G, and E. It's a 6 chord. You could analyze this also as a rootless 4 chord in first inversion as well. But then we have 6 going to 1 here in the bass, so we usually see 4-6 going to 1 in this context, but here we have no C, so in this context, we usually see the leading tone connecting the bass at minimum, and we almost have a complete 7 chord here happening in passing, but this G here keeps us from completely analyzing it. Regardless, we still have 6 going to 1 with that passing connecting leading tone. G, G, B, and D connecting to our tonic. This B is a chord tone, this G is also a chord tone, a little bit of vocal exchange going on here. Then we have C, E, G, and D. This D is a suspension, so we know that a 4 chord is being implied here, C major, but as the C resolves, we get a switch up from Bach. We get D, we get A, and we get F sharp all happening at the same time, which interrupts the suspension's resolution and changes it to a 5-7 chord, a D7 chord happening on the and, very tricky, but creates a normative progression regardless. It's pretty cool that he's done that twice so far with the 3 times so far with the passing 5 chords. Very dense chorale. Then we have E, G, G, and B. This is a completely voiced E minor triad, passing tone in the tenor. And then we have another E minor triad here happening on the downbeat of the cadential measure. So no need to reanalyze. This D is a passing tone. This C is a passing tone. This D is also a non-chord tone, so we have double passing in the tenor. And then we have chromaticism, C sharp, E, G, and A. That's A7 over C sharp. That is a secondary dominant. That's 5-6-5 of 5, as A is the dominant of D, and D is our 5, or our dominant, so 5-6-5 of 5. And then we have D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the tenor. And then we have G major in root position, G, B, G, and G, an incomplete triad. Then we have a phrase that ends here. Sorry, the fermatas did not make it into this copy, unfortunately. But then we have G, D, G, and B. It's a 1 chord again, no need to reanalyze. Then we have C, C, G, and E. That is a C major triad in root position. That's a 4 chord, passing tone in the bass. Then we have E, B, G, and E. That is, that would be kind of like an E minor chord, because this is a half cadence in the key of G major, so we could analyze this as 2, but the C sharp feels a little bit more significant. Actually, you know what? There has been some subdivision of the rhythm here. Here we have E, an E minor triad, and happening on the and of the beat is a 5 chord, C sharp, A, G, and E, or more specifically a 5-7 chord in root position, or a 5-6-5, and then we cadence. Or sorry, I analyzed that wrong. That's why I was thinking we were in the key of D major here, but no, we're still in G. This is 5-6-5 of 5 happening on the and of 3, and then on 4 we have 5, D major. Then we move to an interesting phrase. We have another set of fermata here, fermate here. And if you remember yesterday's chorale, if you did watch the video, or if you haven't watched it, you'll see that this same phrase structure existed in yesterday's chorale as well. We have these 2 4-beat long phrases. Here we had a very interesting cadence that was like a brief visitation to B minor, then we got a weird cadence in E minor, or did we even leave the key of G major? We talked about it at length, but here it's much clearer cut. We get the F natural, we get C natural, we're moving to the key of C at some point. So we have another D major chord here, D, D, F sharp, and A. It's a 5 chord in root position, passing tone in the bass, and then we have not G major, but G7. We have a descending, sort of like a descending line here, F sharp, F natural, E. So instead of going to 1, we go to 5-6-5 of 4, because this the tonic is also the dominant of the subdominant, and this is also our common chord that we move to the key of C major with. It's just 5-6-5. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and then we go to not 1, we would expect 1, but that's the last chord of the measure. This is an imperfect authentic cadence, by the way. We have D, B, F, and D, which is 7-6, B diminished over D. This C is a non-chord tone, this B is a chord tone. No need to mark it though. It would be like taking the chord and putting it in first inversion, but it is happening at the same time as a C, so that kind of complicates the analysis a little bit if we're looking literally at the chord tones. But we have a diminished sonority that's happening here, and then we go to 1. So we have an interesting progression of 5 going to 7. This isn't unprecedented. We have seen 5 go to 7 before, but I like to think about two dominant chords or dominant functioning chords that follow in succession as just the idea of just thinking about that as dominant. They're not really separate chords. They're chords that contain the same notes for the most part, or the same tones, but it's just extending the idea of the dominant over. It's just kind of interesting to see it in a cadential configuration. 5 going to 7 going to 1. 5 really doesn't have like a predominant sort of sound, but the fact that a secondary dominant is happening kind of sorta. It is, like I said, kind of cramming, or not, well, it's like I said yesterday, cramming a modulation into such a short space can be very, it can kind of convolute the effect of changing key, as opposed to like the next phrase, which is very clearly in the key of D major for its entirety. Here we have a phrase that's in the key of C major for a very short period of time. Cramming a modulation into such a short period of time can be kind of difficult, a very unexpected twist. But regardless, we then go to G major, G, B, D, and B. It's a 5 chord, which I also think is our pivot chord to the key of D major, which is 4 in the key of D major. It's now our subdominant. This E is an on-chord tone. This G is a chord tone. And then we go to C sharp, E, G, and A. It's A7 over C sharp. This is a chord we've seen before twice, right here and right here. And so we have 4 going to 5, 6, 5. That's a good sign. And then on the end of the beat here, we actually have our resolution. We have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 1 chord, D major. Remember, we're in the key of D major now. And then we go to B, D, F sharp, and G. That is G major over F, or G major 7 over B. That's a 4, 6, 5. Some passing tones. We have C, we have A, we have E, and we have G. More specifically, we have C sharp. So on the and, again, we have another 5, 6, 5 chord. A7 over C sharp, and that resolves where we would expect, or where you would, in the direction in which we would expect. The C sharp goes up, the 7th of the chord resolves down, the chord from a voice leading standpoint resolves where we would expect, but we get a little bit of shenanigans like we did in yesterday's chorale, where we have this very peculiar D major chord that has an E in it that doesn't resolve until the next measure. Here we have D, A, E, and F sharp, so we have the full ingredients, all of the ingredients for the D major chord, but the E natural here is this expressive suspension that occurs, and we get the chord tone here, but we don't get the full resolution until the next measure. So this G is an on-chord tone, this E is an on-chord tone, and kind of here we have A, F sharp, and F sharp, and where we might be tempted to call that like a 3-6 chord, like an F sharp minor over A, I think what's being implied here is actually a 1-6-4 chord, even though the D is not explicitly occurring in the chord on that beat. I think really this is just a 3-beat, or sorry, not 3-beat. This is a 2-beat reference to the chord, and in fact, maybe we don't even need to mark it because that A is a chord tone regardless. Nevertheless, you could, I guess, kind of say that there is a 6-4 chord there, so I did talk about it at length. I will put it in parentheses. But then we get F sharp, A, D, and F. That's like taking the chord and putting it in first inversion. And then we even go as far as taking the chord and putting it back into root position on the end of beat 1. And as we get ready for our perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, we have A, D, and E. Another suspension over the bass instead of like a 9/8 suspension like we have here. This is a 4/3 suspension. This is just a 5 chord passing or neighboring 7th in the alto before we cadence on D major, which is our 1, our tonic. And I think this is also our pivot back to the key of G, because our next phrase is in the key of G. It ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G as well, and D is no longer our tonic but rather our dominant. We then have, oh, you know what? I made the same mistake in my notes too. There's no reason why we need to mark it here. We can mark it after this redundant D right here, D, F sharp, A, and D. We could say that it happens there instead. That's where it feels like 5 is going to 1. So G, B, B, and E, a deceptive progression again. Here we have It's really deceptive because we have the fourth motion in the bass here. It sounds like 5 going to 1, which is what's happening if we look at this particular voice, but the E in the melody throws us for a loop. This is actually E minor in first inversion. And then we have passing tones in the bass that kind of give us a connecting 7 chord, F sharp, A, and E, but this B throws us for a loop. It's not part of the chord, it's not a chord tone, so we can't explicitly mark this as a 7 chord, but we could talk about it. Then we have B, D, B, and D, and with this F sharp here, that fully spells out a B minor triad in root position, so we have 6 going to 3. This is an example of what I've been calling a transitive chord progression, where the chord goes against the grain of the cycle of falling fifths, and instead goes up the cycle. It's like the cycle of raising fifths, or ascending fifths. Bach does this quite often, and it's just approaching the dominant from a different direction, like going towards 4, which would then go to 5, and then go to 1, which I think is actually what's going to happen here. So we have 3 going to E, G, G, and C, which is C major over E. That's a 4-6 chord. And as we know, with 4-6 chords that ascend, or 6 chords that ascend like we had here, there's always going to be that, or maybe not always, there has been one instance where if we're going to the tonic via like a passing tone, that passing tone is going to always be the leading tone. We're never going to, well, the only passing tone that it could be would be the leading tone. Virtually all the time we're going to see E connected to G via an F sharp if it's 4-6 going to 1. That's something I've found. We have a very similar progression here. Instead of 6 going to 1, we have 4-6 going to 1, where we still have that G suspended somewhere. Here we have 2 passing tones, but it's like the tenor is getting what the alto's line had here in the second phrase. But regardless, it still goes to 1. We still have like an implied 7 chord here, but the G is being suspended, so it makes it kind of hard to analyze that as its own standalone 7 chord, even though the voices are kind of alluding to it. So that's kind of the nice thing about a video, is that we could talk about these sorts of things. This D is a chord tone, so we don't need to analyze it. We then have A, C sharp, E, and A, or sorry, C, C, E, and A. That's A minor in first inversion, 2-6 chord, passing tone, or a little delayed passing tone in the tenor before we get D, A, D, and A, which is a thirdless 5 chord. It's still implying 5, but there's no leading tone, and I think that's how yesterday's chorale ended too. Lots of thirdless triads throughout. Not as many as yesterday's, but we have a couple. We have one here where it's just G, D, G, and D. We have a couple of them throughout the chorale. Yesterday was a theme where we saw a lot of thirdless triads. But yeah, here we have a thirdless 5 chord, which is kind of oxymoronic in a way because it's the leading tone that wants to resolve to the tonic in the first place. It's one of the main contributing factors. But regardless, we go to our tonic at the end. G, B, D, and G. Root position triad. 2, 6, 5, 1 is about as normative of a cadential progression as we can get, and that is today's analysis. Again, if you're looking for a complete analysis of this particular chorale setting with the instrumental interludes, you're going to have to look elsewhere. I'm focusing primarily on vocal writing, so whenever I encounter an anomaly of a chorale like this one, where the vocal writing is still chorale-like in texture, but there's instrumental interludes, I'm going to exclude the instrumental writing because it's not really in the same vein, and analyzing instrumentally composed music is a little bit different. You have to infer, and it's not consistent with the same expectations that I have of vocal writing, very deliberate, harmonically rhythmic chorale writing, which is what my area of focus is. But regardless, this is one of the better examples where the chorale is consistent throughout and exhibits a lot of the same characteristics as the reference chorale we had yesterday, so they're paired together very nicely. But on that note, very straightforward chorale today. Everything's more or less functionally harmonic. I'd say maybe the most interesting progression is probably here at the beginning, where 5 resolves to 5 of 4, which, the triad is there, but the change of 7/3 contextualizes where it's going, so we're thrown for a loop and Bach spins us off in the direction of C major rather than D major or staying in the key of G major. But thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel. If this is the first video of mine that you're watching and you're catching me while I'm recording this series, feel free to subscribe and click the notification icon so that you know when I upload. I upload once a day, and I'm currently working on all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations, so if you'd like a daily dose of Bach, if you'd like a daily dose of analysis, feel free to follow me along on this journey. Thank you again so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.